Good day, and welcome to the Patently Strategic Podcast, where we discuss all things at the intersection of business, technology, and patents. This podcast is a monthly discussion amongst experts in the field of patenting. It's for inventors, founders, and IP professionals alike, established or aspiring. In this episode, we tackle the near-death experience of a final rejection. That's the sound of your application receiving a final rejection notice from the patent office. But how final is final? The office owes you nothing at this point, and without further action, your patent is as good as dead. Good news though, all may not be lost. Options for resuscitation are limited, but the patient isn't a goner yet. David Jackrel, president of Jackrel Consulting, leads a discussion along with our all-star patent panel, digging into the specifics of after final practice, or AFP. After final practice is one of the three primary options for getting a patent application on life support and breathing again, but it has the unique combination of being lesser known but also requiring the least effort and expense, making it a wonderful target for a strategy discussion. The insider tips on best practices for working with examiners during this process are worth the listen alone. David is joined today by an exceptional group of IP experts, including Ashley Sloat, President and Director of Patent Strategy here at Aurora Consulting, Daniel Wright, Partnership Manager and Patent Strategist here at Aurora, Steve Stupp, Partner at Stupp Associates LLC, and Dominic Felice, Patent Expert at Parola Analytics, Inc. Now, before handing this over to David and the panel, we're going to break our normal form a little. After reviewing the conversation, we decided that some extra upfront context might be helpful for our broader audience. For that, I'm joined by Ashley Sloat to help us with some stage setting. All right, Ashley, first question, what is a final rejection?
Thanks, Josh. So when you file your patent application with the patent office and it is finally picked up by an examiner, the examiner does a search and during this process, it's called prosecution, where the examiner does searches, you amend or edit your claims, make arguments, and then they do updated searches, and then you may amend or make arguments again. So this whole process is called prosecution. And so during the activity of prosecution, you get rejections. And so usually a final rejection comes after your claims have already been once rejected. Now, sometimes you can get a second non-final rejection, and that's if maybe the art wasn't appropriate, maybe the examiner fully missed the mark, or maybe sometimes you've fully overcome the rejections and it's a new set of rejections, but that is quite rare. So usually a final rejection comes when your claims have already been rejected once. And so now they're being finally rejected. And that final rejection represents the close of one round of prosecution.
Okay, thanks. So as you alluded to, the word final obviously indicates that this wasn't the first rejection. How common is it to get one or more earlier rejections from patent offices during the prosecution of an application?
Yeah, so I would say it's highly common to get at least one rejection, and if not even get two. And so like I said, that represents one round of prosecution. You have a non-final rejection, and then depending on if you just make arguments, the examiner will not conduct another search. Instead, they will just review your arguments and see whether you have swayed him or her. If you make amendments to your claims, that will then encourage them to do another search. And then during that second search, they may find additional references or art that they can use to reject your claims. And so then they send you a final rejection. And if, for example, you still have not overcome the art, maybe the examiner is unconvinced, or maybe you haven't gone far enough with your claim amendments, then you may be kicked into a second round of prosecution, or there's a few other things that you can do that we'll obviously be talking about here today. And so you can go through multiple rounds of prosecution. And then, two, I guess to this end, sometimes it is said, you can get a first action notice of allowance, where sometimes you never get rejections. And sometimes that can be good for a startup that just needs a patent quick. Maybe the claims are slightly more narrow and you get that first action allowance. But more often than not, if you get that first action allowance, no rejections, then maybe you didn't ask for enough in your claims, right? Maybe your claims could have been broader. But sometimes when that happens, it's better just to take what you're given and run. And then through a continuation, through a second application, then broaden out your claims to get more scope, more breadth. And so there's lots of different strategy pieces you can put into place there, whether or not you get a first rejection or a first allowance.
So we specifically delve into after final practice or AFCP 2.0 program in this episode as a means of trying to deal with a final rejection, but it's not the only approach for dealing with a final rejection. Could you briefly describe the three main options, how they compare, and when AFCP makes the most sense versus the other two?
Yeah, so there, when you get to that final rejection, as we described, you can either appeal the decision, which means that you basically send it to the Patent Trial and Appeal Board or the PTAB for them to weigh in on the rejections and the arguments, so they can weigh in favor of the applicant or you. They can weigh in favor of the examiner, or they can weigh in favor of both of you in some shades. There is also the request for continued examination, or RCE, that I alluded to, which basically you pay additional money to the patent office for them to review your application again in a second round of prosecution. So again, another non-final, another final, or hopefully, you get it through quite quickly. And then of course, there's the after final consideration program. In terms of how to compare, I would say appeal is best suited for, you really hit a wall with the examiner, but you really think you have a solid case. And because that is a long process and it can be somewhat expensive just from the appeal fees and then the preparation of the appeal brief and the responses. And then from a request for continued examination, you're paying an additional fee for the patent office to do their job again, right? Because they're going to do another search again. The examiner is going to reject it again or hopefully allow it. But sometimes you do just need to pay that extra fee to kind of get the examiner to review it again, and then they might allow it right away. And that has definitely happened because the after final consideration program only allows the examiner so much time to review things after final. And so sometimes they just need you to pay that fee so they can spend more time and then kick it to allowance. I mean, it sounds really silly, but they all have times that they're allotted to do different things. And if it's going to extend beyond that, then you have to pay that additional fee. For after final consideration program, these are very specific requirements. And so this is not something to be used as all the time. It's really for those amendments that are very clearly going to put the application in condition for allowance. They're not broadening at all. Because if you broaden, the examiner for sure is going to have to do another search, and that will be too much time for them to spend, and they'll want you to do that request for continued examination. And I would definitely base it on conversations that you had with the examiner where you said, well, if I just do this little tweak, it would be allowed, right? And he's gonna be like, yeah, you're pretty sure, make it and we'll see. But those are the situations where it's like, just fine tuning things that you want to do the AFCP for. If it's anything that's extensive, extensive amendments, broadening amendments, or anything like that, it doesn't make sense to waste your time with AFCP. And it just makes sense to pay that RCE fee and go to the next round of prosecution or maybe appeal. But your practitioner should know, like I said, it's not, AFCP is a very unique case to when you want to use that. And it's not an all the time sort of approach. So there's some of the main ways, like I said, appeal, a request for continued examination, and then the after final consideration program.
So in your practice, or maybe even more broadly, if there's, I don't know if there's data available on this, but once somebody gets to this point of a final rejection, any idea roughly what percentage of apps that use one of these pathways still end up with some angle of patentability? Like how, just roughly how successful are these three paths?
Yeah. And, I don't know the stats on that, but it is highly art unit dependent. So when your application goes into the patent office, depending on the technology that's in the claims, it's going to be tracked into an art unit where it has examiners that are skilled in that kind of technology. So whether it be business methods or semiconductors or chemistry, it's going to be tracked into that art unit. And every art unit has its own statistics around what their allowance rate is, essentially. So I don't know how well they break. I'm sure they have statistics somewhere, whether we're privy to that or not, I'm not sure. But they have statistics around their allowance rate. So I would say most art units you're going to find are probably somewhere in the 50 to 80% allowance rate. Now, some art units, like different software art units or business method art units, they're going to be a lot lower because of, everybody knows the Alice decisions and all the software issues that we've had to date. But I would say most allowance rates are going to be in that 50 to 80%. And it also, though, is dependent. I would argue that you can almost always get an allowed claim set, but the tougher your route through prosecution, the more likely you're going to end up with more narrow claims. And so it's this balance of value and a balance of breadth, right? Because somewhere in between those two worlds is your claim set or the value of your claim set. And so for some startups, it's really just getting that patent. So if it's a little bit more narrow, at least at the outset, that's fine. Then we'll go back for broader claims later. But for some other companies, they really need that breadth, or maybe their technology warrants that breadth. And so then you may fight a little bit more, pay a little bit more money to maybe try to get that broader claim at the outset. But then there's also the increased risk that maybe you can't, and you end up not in that allowance category. And so, but there is, even if you're in that category, there are additional steps that you can do to kind of restart the clock in different ways. So not all is not lost, but I would say most art units are in that 50 to 80%. It's even examiner by examiner dependent, right? But that's where I think we always encourage the clients and ourselves to talk with examiners after non-final, when you do have the right to an interview, because a lot of times the examiners, they're humans too, and they just need, they need to be understood. They need to understand where you're coming from. You need to understand where they're coming from. And sometimes it's just certain words that they're misunderstanding, or certain words that they like to see that can get to allowance. And so again, so we're all humans. And so sometimes that human interaction is the thing that can make the difference.
Okay, fantastic. So, if I'm understanding correctly, then these mechanisms can be highly effective in getting something over the finish line, but can oftentimes come with the compromise of getting more narrowed coverage than what you were originally after.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, there's, not to say that there isn't, but, once you kind of find out what the examiner is going to cling to, right? What is the patentable thing of your claims, in which you'll find out during prosecution, right? It's whatever the amendments that you're making, those are the things that are going to sway the examiner, right? So once you pinpoint which amendment or amendments were the thing that swayed the examiner, in theory, all the other stuff in the claim could be broadened out, right? Not crazy, but broadened out to some degree, because you've now found the linchpin that the examiner is going to claim to. And so that's kind of that. And you kind of start to build a rapport with the examiner, relationship with the examiner too. So they know that you're not trying to skate one by them, or, to be shady. They understand that, you're trying to keep the patentable piece that maybe brought out other elements that maybe don't need to be as narrow. And that, like I said, you can do through continuation practice, where you pursue additional claim sets in additional applications that still are within that same family tree of your original application.
All right. Thanks, Ashley. Very helpful. Now, without further ado, take it away, David.
So, after final practice, this is going to be really short. It was mainly, I have not done a lot of these, and I wanted to learn about it. That's why I took the VILT course. And then I thought, there's some interesting tidbits, but it's not, that other people might be interested in too, but it's not that immediate of a topic. So I won't try not to bog down and, just kind of introduce these things. But at the same time, if anybody had any stories to share or questions or whatever, feel free to jump in. Start with the traditional. This is all after a final rejection. So after a final rejection, of course, basically prosecution is closed and your options are limited. So after final, amendments are allowed. And what they have to do in the traditional after final amendment is either place the application in condition for allowance or in better form for appeal. So let's say you got a first action, you made a bunch of amendments. The independent claims were all rejected, but some of your dependent claims were allowed. Typically, that I would imagine it's possible, but typically an examiner wouldn't do that by examiner amendment, because they don't want to make that decision, right, for the client. So that would be in a very appropriate place for an after final amendment. All you're doing is saying, okay, we want to change this dependent claim to be an independent form, and it would be allowable. But it's not allowable now, so you don't have to RCE to get that kind of thing done. Or obviously, get in better form for appeal, canceling claims you don't care about, fixing maybe some 112 issues that may have popped up, things like that. It allows both the applicant and examiner to clarify the record, essentially. And then after filing your after final amendment, you will get an advisory action. And the advisory action is going to be less formal than a complete office action. But still can be really helpful, as they say here, to to make a decision deciding whether you want to go up the RCE or appeal route, or even maybe abandon, depending on what the examiner says in that advisory action. So then there's it's not so new anymore, but relatively new, is this after final consideration program, AFCP 2.0, which is currently going. It's been extended through September, and I think everyone believes it's going to be extended beyond that as well. This is basically allows a little bit more time for the examiner. So it's designed where response to a final rejection will likely lead to an allowance with only limited further searching and or consideration. So this is beyond what would normally be allowed in an after final amendment, and you can specifically apply for this AFCP 2.0 program to give the examiner a little bit more time if it is eligible. So what you need to do is amend at least one independent claim in a non-broadening way. Interesting, it says non-broadening and not limiting. So I think there is little wiggle room there. But then you have this form, as well as a statement that you're open to an interview, which is sort of part of the process, as we'll see in kind of the next couple slides. There's a little flow chart. The decision about whether something is eligible for this AFCP 2.0 is in the judgment of the examiner solely. They should basically determine if further consideration can be completed in the allotted time. And I think some, if not many, people recommend kind of calling the examiner, saying, this is what we're planning to do, and this is the amendment we're thinking about. Would this be eligible? And then talk to the examiner about it up front, and then maybe they can help you figure out what would be in scope and what would be out of scope for such a thing. Even if the AFCP 2.0 request is admitted, accepted, so then the examiner does this additional consideration or searching, then the amendments may or may not actually be entered. This is an interesting little point, I guess. If the claim amendments result in a notice of allowance, then they will enter them and allow the application. If the amendments after the examiner searches, after considers, decides no, the prior art teaches these proposed amendments, then not only is it not allowed, but those amendments are actually not even entered. So then you would be back to where you were as of the final rejection at that point.
Hey, David, quick question.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody has experience with this or if they covered this at some point, but so, historically, my understanding is that when things were sent via fax, those things were not entered, but nowadays more and more email correspondence is happening between examiners and practitioners to where you could send proposed amendments. So in that situation, if you sent via email, for example, or even fax, I think they were entering them even from fax at this point, they may not enter them in the sense that the claims, like that's the most current state of the claims, but those amendments would still be found in the file wrapper, right? They don't really disappear.
Okay. I see.
Right? I don't know. It's more of like a question than it is a statement.
I'm pretty sure that you're right, that official communications, faxes and emails, being to examiners are kept in the file wrapper. I'm pretty sure about that, but I'm not 100%. I know, like for instance, right, you can email or fax a interview agenda, and those are definitely in the file wrapper. I don't know about any email or fax communication, but I think, like you said, unless it's an actual amendment, filed amendment, they won't be entered unless you ask the examiner to do something by examiner amendment.
Right.
So it's definitely been in that situation where the examiner has found a bunch, stuff. Basically, most often it's kind of like something's going right to allowance, and the examiner will call and be like, I found a few antecedent basis things, blah blah. Do you want me to do them by examiner amendment just to speed it along or something like that, And then I've gone through with them on the phone, sometimes as many as 5 or 10 different things, and sometimes they mess them up. So having an email or something like that in that case, I think would be helpful to request like an examiner amendment, and then maybe they would get entered. But again, I'm not sure about the record.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. It just makes me wonder then too, from like even the case that they're not entered. Sorry for the background noise. We have work being done in the room right next door. So So even in the case where they aren't technically entered, but if they're in the file history, does anybody know if that counts from like a prosecution estoppel perspective? Because you thought about disclaiming some of the scope, but maybe because you didn't do it, then it doesn't count.
Does anybody else? So,
Yeah,
like,
I don't know. I would venture to guess that it does still count when it was something that you presented in good faith to the patent office, and then for procedural reason didn't get entered. Well, again, entered meaning updated to the working version of the claims. But yeah, I don't know. I've done a fair number of AFCP 2.0s, but they've generally have kind of been. I've done it when I know it's a slam dunk, like when I've had okay, you know, option A versus option B for something, and option B is probably guaranteed, but narrower than the client would, you know, necessarily want to go with right off the bat. So you try A, and then A is not good enough. It's like, all right, well, B is probably good enough, so let me just like slip that in. And normally, like, frequently also I'll try to like talk to the examiner like sooner, and then get his or her blessing and then turn it in. So this situation I'm actually not so sure on. I'm not sure I've had an AFCP 2.0 like get rejected, because I've ever used it when we were really confident.
Okay.
Yeah, we've actually had a fair. Oh, go ahead, David.
Yeah, I was gonna. Were you gonna say that you have had them rejected?
Yeah, I would say like a lot of times they don't. If they're not like very narrowly fit into that little, you know, snug opportunity, I feel like more often than not they make you pay the fee.
Yeah, that's kind of been. I've only seen a few of them, but that's what I've seen as well. If it's really narrow, but still beyond what's sort of allowable by the letter for a normal after final, they'll accept it to the AFCP 2.0 and let it go through almost rubber stamp. But more complicated one, at least one or two that I've seen didn't work. But I wonder. I don't know a lot about prosecution estoppel actually either, but I wonder if it might matter why the amendments weren't entered at that time. So if you email or fax something, for instance, and the examiner says, no, this is out of scope, I'm not even going to consider it, that's why they're not entered, I would imagine if that situation doesn't flow forward, right? So like in the future, if you try to do those same amendments, you wouldn't be estoppel from doing it again if they're going to now be examined on the merits. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So if it's not been entered, it's as if it never happened.
Okay. Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
I like it.
And I think I could see how that can make sense, because even if they, do this AFCP 2.0, they have a limited amount of time to search. They might just be like, kind of say no, but then given more time to search it, they could have come to a different conclusion, I guess. So, okay.
Do the examiners then give a summary of the discussions like they would for a typical interview? Because one thing I could see is if they don't quite summarize everything that your side really agreed to, or in the same words, that you'd want something there to correct that interpretation as well. So something I need to educate myself on further here too.
No, so what they do is typically what happens is the advisory actions kind of they will not comment on your claim amendments. They tend to just say things like, sometimes they're incredibly terse and just say like, this raises new issues that would require further search, not entered. Sometimes they'll say that, and then they'll give a little short few sentences where they'll say, we found this one reference. Because of that, I think I would need to consider this more carefully. And they'll tell you the reference and what was relevant if they're trying to be helpful. But they won't sit there and say, like, you use this language and you should have used that language. They don't really comment on what you've done. So when it's not entered, it really isn't very limiting on your future prosecution options. So it's actually usually at worst, it doesn't change much. And at best, you might get an interview or get something in writing that gives you a hint of where you might be able to take things.
Yeah, thanks, Steven. Yeah, that I've also seen similar kind of things in the few that I've seen. There are rules as they went over for these AFCP 2.0 for the examiners, and the examiners are supposed to substantively respond to any kind of substantive argument. They're supposed to respond to all the arguments, but as Steve said, I think it's not as formal and complete. So they focus more on analysis and cutting to the chase rather than every one of your amendments. And so yeah. But they are supposed to respond at least in some way to every argument that's been raised. And if they don't think that they can do that in the amount of time that they're allotted, they're supposed to say, no, this is out of scope for AFCP 2.0, not admitted. So just a couple of quick things to kind of a little bit of a review, but also shows, the examiner first step is just to determine whether or not it's proper, whether or not whether it falls within the scope of AFCP 2.0. If it's improper, they just say, sorry, no, and they do the normal pre-pilot, the normal after final practice. But if it is proper, they'll then sort of say, they'll review the amendment, I guess, and go on to the actual kind of analysis. And then in their analysis, they're granted up to 3 hours plus this 10-day kind of management clock adjustment thing. And if they do find it allowable, they'll mail the allowance, pretty straightforward. But if it's not allowable, then they initiate an interview. And as you remember, like when you sign up for AFCP2, when you apply, you commit to joining one of these interviews if asked. And then if the examiner does not want to initiate an interview, they'll just mail this advisory action. And if they do, then they can go back again, well, after the interview is allowable or not. And so, that's basically the flow. So just to wrap up, what's the difference? AFCP 2.0 provides more time to examiners. And they didn't say it here, but also an extra point. So it's actually kind of a low hour point as far as I understand it. And examiners are a little bit motivated to take these if they can. A relatively well-known patent practitioner, I recall, told us that what they tend to do is file a traditional after final response with whatever they're proposing to do. And then if the examiner declines to examine it, they'll call them and ask them if that amendment that they just submitted would be eligible for this AFCP 2.0. As Dan was talking, I think I like his method as well. So I don't think that's necessarily the way to go. I do think that calling the examiner at some point before you apply for this is a good idea to help to figure out that you're actually in scope or not. And then just as a kind of what is proper and improper for AFCP 2.0 as compared to traditional, if there's simple amendments, just like canceling claims or making independent claims, making dependent claims into independent form, that should be done in a traditional amendment and an AFCP 2.0 is not needed. AFCP 2.0 is really needed for additional searching, additional consideration, things like that. So that's all that I had.
Awesome. Thanks, David. Well, if nobody has anything else, then I will set you all free.
All right.
Yeah, nothing else here.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Ashley.
Yeah, thank you both.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Have a good day.
All right, that's all for today, folks. Thanks for listening, and remember to check us out at aurorapatents.com for more great podcasts, blogs, and videos covering all things patent strategy. And if you're an agent or attorney and would like to be part of the discussion or an inventor with a topic you'd like to hear discussed, email us at podcast@aurorapatents.com. Do remember that this podcast does not constitute legal advice, and until next time, keep calm and patent on.